I have the great good fortune, Nick, to introduce to you a giant of Hellenic behavior analysis. He was the greatest Hellenic behavior analyst before there was a Hellenic behavior analysis. Paul Andronis is a great friend of our approach and efforts here in Greece. He's a member of the advisory board for the Hellenic Association for Behavior Analysis. It's his second visit to our laboratory and university, and we're just so lucky to have him here. Paul is a professor of psychology at Northern Michigan University in Marquette, Michigan, which I understand now is under a foot or two of snow. But it's a beautiful place, and he invites applications from our fine graduates from our programs here to study at his university. Paul got his PhD in biopsychology from the University of Chicago, and like Joe Lang, he worked with the great Israel Gould Diamond, and at the same time that he was doing his work in biopsychology, because his field is he does many different things, but one of the most important things he does is work in the relation between evolutionary biology and behavior analysis. And while he was doing the biopsychology degree, he also worked in pioneering work in applications of behavior analysis in mental hospitals with people with all kinds of various different kinds of psychotic difficulties and other kinds of difficulties. And at the same time, he made his tuition playing music in the Bouzouki magazine of Chicago. A very skilled person. His work is concentrated in social behavior, in problem solving, in the generation of novel behavior, and in particular by contingency adduction, but also by other means. His work exemplifies the continuity of the experimental analysis of behavior and evolutionary biology, how our knowledge of evolution can help us to establish, maintain, and change behavior in practical situations. We're so happy to have him here. Please join me in welcoming Paul Andronis.
Θέλω να πω πρώτο, όπως είμαι τόσο ευχαριστημένος που ρώτησε ο Ρόμπερτ να έρθω να σε μιλήσω και να σου πω πόσο ευλογημένη είσαι εσύ που έχετε τέτοιο δάσκαλο. So, ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ. Και συγγνώμη που θα σου μιλήσω σε αγγλικά, αλλά τα λέω τα ελληνικά σπασμένα. So, θα πω τώρα. I don't know if in Greek you have an expression, first world problems, but I'll give you an example. A first world problem is when we come to Greece, people complain that the Wi-Fi on the airplane doesn't work. And, you know, the whole time, it doesn't work. There are people in the world who don't have water and who then don't have homes. And those are things to feel bad about, not missing Wi-Fi. That's what we mean by a first world problem. And part of what I'm going to talk about today is something that I consider to be a first world problem of a different sort. It's a technological problem. And it's in part because the United States, having Skinner be a native of the United States, behavior analysis had a very early start there. And it was popularized there and then transmitted to other places. And so we are running into problems now that other countries who are just starting off on this road don't have yet. And part of what I would like to talk about is a sort of a warning or a caution to think about maybe taking a different path of development for the field.
Well, could I just interrupt you for a second? We're videotaping you, so if you could just move here. Some people don't get to see you, and many people want to see you many times. So
Okay.
just stand there.
Okay.
We'll be able to see you and other times as well.
Okay, so what I would like to do is talk a little bit about what is happening with behavior analysis in the United. You mean I'm stuck in this window here? This is Oh, this is terrible. That's why I have one of these, because I wander around the room when I talk.
Can we put some furniture around? Give me some.
Okay. What I would like to talk about a little bit is to describe what's happening in the United States with the field and what that's likely to lead to in some respects. To describe why I think it's a problem and what kinds of problems I think it leads to, and to look at a different future, especially in a country like Greece where you have the opportunity to shape your profession uniquely for Greece. And I will give you a hint that I consider the future, the road to the future, actually looking back to see how the field began. So with that in mind, I'll just give you a little bit of a background. Behavior analysis actually came about after the real growth in behavior modification. Behavior modification was taking basic behavioral principles and devising ways of changing behavior in a very technical way. In the United States, behavior modification involved very little analysis per se once the initial problems were identified. They looked at deficits and at excesses of behavior. They used reinforcement procedures for the deficits and punishment generally for excesses and extinction. It was very popular, but it also incurred the disdain of people in other areas of psychology who thought of it as being very superficial. This is all surface behavior. There's nothing about the psyche involved in any of this. This is dog training, and it's fine for defective people, defective humans, kids with autism, although at that time when the field began, autism was a mystery. Nobody even knew what it was. But mental retardation, prisoners, and so on. And people that no other psychologist wanted to work with got dumped in the laps of behaviorists, and they dealt with those things. But behavior modification was very popular. Albert Bandura of social learning theory began as a behavior modifier. In fact, he wrote one of the first textbooks in behavior modification, and it was only later, maybe 10 years after he established some reputation in behavior modification, did he go to the deep end and talk about well, he turned all of the operant paradigm into a cognitive set of variables and created social learning theory, and then disappeared a few years later. People still talk about him historically, but his contributions were very limited to the field. But behavior modification, as I said, was considered superficial. It didn't treat important things. It didn't treat important psychiatric problems in adults. It didn't ask questions about how we think and how we feel. In fact, people characterized behavior modification as being devoid of feelings, and behavior modifiers and behavior analysts as being devoid of a real science. It was all technique. They also objected to changing other people's behavior. Who gives you the right to change other people's behavior and manipulate their behavior? That was a pressing question. Anyway, the field of the experimental analysis of behavior, meanwhile, was growing sort of parallel, and really by the late 1960s began to take off. It was about 10 years of the Journal of Experimental Analysis of Behavior. There was 10 years of really amazing progress in understanding the fundamental principles of behavior. And at that point, most training programs were experimental programs, and if you wanted to do applied things, you got that training on the side. And in fact, most of the original behavior analysts, Ogden Lindsley, you might know his name, but Og Lindsley was the first person to apply operant procedures with humans in an institutional setting at Massachusetts General Hospital. Nate Azarin, who invented the token economy and so on, had no clinical background when he took over Anna State Hospital, and this was right after he had completed all of his pioneering work in punishment and aversive control. So these people, the original behavior analysts, even the applied behavior analysis analysts, came from a background of the experimental analysis and had a thoroughgoing knowledge of the details of the control of behavior. Because the field was growing, and in the late 60s, Don Baer and others were concerned that applied behavior analysis was being given a cold shoulder. I shouldn't say that, but there was a rift beginning between people with experimental interests and people who were in the applied area. And it wasn't emotional, it wasn't hot, but people disagreed about what should be the focus of training. Don Baer actually was somebody who advocated the thorough training in the science of behavior for all behavior analysts, and that the applied analysis be as scientific as the others, except it's applied science and it's done in natural settings. And he advocated for that in the very famous 1968 article on the dimensions of applied behavior analysis. He was actually quite opposed to making it just a technical field. He insisted that behavior analysts should still continue to ask questions about what is faith. You know, we don't even hear that discussion nowadays, but Nate Schoenfeld, one of the early people in the field of behavior analysis, actually wrote a whole book. It was a functional analysis of religion. And it was brilliant, and it was something that if people were interested in understanding those things and in communicating how we handle those things, that would have been a good starting place, but it's lost. People don't read it. And I'm afraid that that's what we're talking about with things getting lost. Part of the reason for these things getting lost is that we now know enough about applied behavior analysis to have to focus very strongly on teaching people how to do those things correctly. They're powerful technologies of behavior, and in order to implement them correctly, you have to be technically skilled. But again, to train people technically and effectively, very often things get lost when you do that. You sacrifice some things for others. And that's one of the things that I'm concerned about. And again, this is a first world problem in the sense that because behavior analysis is so developed as a field in the United States, that we're sort of rushing ahead with some of these things without taking the time to think about exactly what's the best way to grow the field. One of the places I would start, and this is something that I think is sort of lost because, you know, we talk about applied behavior analysis. Part of the problem is that we don't analyze behavior. We analyze the contingencies that control behavior. There's not much to analyzing behavior if you don't have the contingency context. And so I want to show you one definition that seems, in one form or another, this is the definition most people agree on. It's everything the organism does, says, thinks, feels. And it includes all kinds of, every movement of every muscle, whether they're small facial muscles, the muscles in the embouchure to produce language, glandular secretions, electrochemical activities. Now that we are able to measure brain waves and actually manipulate those through operant procedures, that's behavior as well. It may be covert. In other words, you can't see it without special instrumentation, but it's behavior. And we can actually shape that and change it. So that's a fairly complete definition. I came to behavior analysis late. I already had a master's degree in molecular biology, and when I got to Dr. Golddiamond's lab, the one thing I wanted to know, because I never saw a really good definition of behavior, I asked him, what is behavior? And this was the answer he gave me. He said, that which is bracketed between, by the discriminative stimulus and the consequence in a contingency relation and attributed to the organism. Now, yeah, I have to tell you, this is my first exposure to Dr. Golddiamond, and I didn't know if he was making fun of me or if I should take this seriously. And when I sat in on his course, it wasn't until maybe the third or fourth lecture where I really appreciated what this definition was about. One of the very first things we did was explore the definitions of contingency, and we couldn't find two textbooks that had the same definition, and none of them was correct. So we started talking about contingency, and he did a very interesting logical analysis, a formal analysis of contingency. But this is the contingency that, oh boy, okay, I'm going to have to do something. I tried to get cute with my PowerPoint presentation, and I will. Okay, this is, see? Okay, this is the familiar three-term contingency that Skinner created in 1938. And there are a couple of important features. One is that he borrowed language from Pavlov so that there would be continuity with the conditioning model. But he was very careful not to put an arrow between the discriminative stimulus and the response. Now, here's a problem with that. Response typically means a response to something. And so even if there's not an arrow there, people assume that it causes the response. That's what response means. And so from the beginning of this model, this was a problem. People couldn't get their heads around the idea that the stimulus wasn't causing the behavior. And Skinner did not mean it to be taken that way. He said, operant behavior is emitted, not elicited. And so there should not be an arrow there. Okay, part of Dr. Gould talk, this is what he was talking about. This is that which is bracketed by the discriminative stimulus and the reinforcer in a contingency relation and attributed to the organism. It's this hole in the middle. And you can put anything in there that actually meets the contingency requirements. And it was a very fulsome and a logical explanation of what a behavior could be. It included just about everything, even things we can't anticipate. Little flickers of neuronal activity. It can be almost anything. But that also takes out the idea that it's a response. Okay? This is something that's emitted by the organism and meets the requirements in the contingency. Well, a few years, as I said, a few years into the applied enterprise, people began trying to simplify it. It's very difficult saying discriminative stimulus. You're a parent of a child with autism. Life is tough enough, and then you have somebody telling you discriminative stimulus and reinforcing stimulus and so on. So Ray Miltenberger and other behavior modifiers, I suspect Ray was one of the first, though, to begin talking about antecedent behavior-consequence relations, because he was trying to give alpha beta gamma, or antecedent behavior consequence. It was a nice mnemonic for remembering the terms of the contingency, but he picks a Latin word that no parent is going to know without you explaining what it is. And this comes from a textbook that he has. It's called Behavior Modification. It's one of the better-selling undergraduate behavior modification textbooks. But you'll notice he's got an arrow here. I stopped using the textbook because when I met him at ABBA and told him, could you take the arrow out of there? It's hard enough teaching this stuff without you having improper diagrams. And he said, oh, I'll take it up with my publisher. That was, the art department did that. 10 years went by and nothing changed. There should not be an arrow here because it misleads what that relation is about. And if you learn that from the beginning, you're not going to learn what stimulus control is actually about. And when you're trying to teach a child something and the stimulus control is what is at issue, you're not going to be able to do it effectively. You may not even know what questions to ask at that point. A few years later, this is 1997, so this was actually started in an earlier version, but in 2005, when the next edition came out, because I called the publisher and I said, listen, I'm going to stop using it. I'm going to advocate that everybody stop using it. This was their solution. They put an arrow behind all of it, which completely obliterates any meaning. But the art department thought it looked good. Talk about tail wagging the dog. Again, one of the problems also is this Latin word, antecedent. Dr. Gould worked a lot with clinical patients. He did a lot of applied work. And so he took a common English word that most people understand in one way or another, occasion. An occasion is Easter, or a birthday, or a wedding. It's an event or a circumstance in which certain things happen. And so he used that term as a way of discussing things with people in applied settings. And he retained behavior and consequence, but the occasion doesn't really make it less precise because SD is a very vague term as it is. There's more to the SD than just the SD. There is an entire history. There are other stimuli that are related that actually determine how you respond to SD. And so when we talk about contingency, this is the three-term contingency. I'm simply translating it from Skinner's to Gould-Diamond's notation system. And this forms the core of our analysis in the applied setting, just as it does in the animal laboratory. That's the core relationship, the paradigma. Well, very quickly things get complicated when you start looking at behavior and what we already know about it. This is the contingency we're talking about here. This is the core contingency, but when Skinner discovered the effects of schedules of reinforcement, we found that the rule that defines the way that the consequence is related to these occasion-behavior relations really influence the timing of the behavior, the intensity, the frequency, a whole variety of features of the behavior. And so the schedule is a variable that you have to take into account, the schedule history, if nothing else. Also, behaviors that produce consequences, the consequences aren't pure. It's not just either a reinforcer or anything else. There are costs involved. The behavior you engage in to study for an exam costs you something. You can't go off to the bouzoukia that night. You can't hang out with your friends. You can't go out and play soccer. It costs you something. If you find a friend who can take the exam for you, you'll get the consequence of a good grade on the exam, but one of the consequences you will not get that way, you might if you study, is you won't learn the material. You'll get a grade, you'll go off to the bouzoukia and get drunk and play soccer afterwards, but you're not going to get the other benefit. There are other alternatives as well. You can write the answers on your hand. You can cram and memorize things for the test and then forget them, so you're not really studying and learning anything. There are many alternatives that will produce one part of this consequence, but they come with different costs. And those different costs and benefits decide which one you're going to do. They select for you which choice you're going to engage in. And so when we talk about choice, the alternatives always come into play. When you look at schedules of reinforcement and the effects of schedules, and the cumulative record is flat in certain places, it doesn't mean there's no behavior. It means the organism is not engaging in the one that's being measured or anything like it, and instead it's off sniffing the corner or licking its paws or pecking at the walls, it screws on the walls, or kids are looking at the floor and kicking their feet, but they're not doing what you're measuring. So the cumulative record of what you're measuring goes flat, but there's still behavior going on. There's a stream. And this model, or this description, is a way of trying to capture the fact that this contingency alone doesn't do anything. In fact, sometimes people engage in the behavior here because everything else is punished. Avoidance behaviors like this, with non-discriminative avoidance, every other behavior the organism can engage in is subjected to punishment until eventually the only thing it can do is the response that eliminates or postpones the shock. And so it's the alternatives that are choosing it. Now, aside from those things, as I said, Jack Michael introduced the term establishing operations in the 1960s at the first neuroscience. There's an invisible fence here. At the first neuroscience conference held by the NSF, Dr. Gould and Joe Brady proposed using something called potentiating variables as a way of talking about what Jack Michael later on talked about as establishing operations. They are things that make any of the elements in the contingency potent. When you go to a golf instructor, the instructor doesn't teach you golf. He makes your stroke more potent so that you can strike the ball farther and have greater accuracy. He makes the behavior more potent. When we deprive an animal of food, we make seeking food and obtaining food potent in the contingency relation. When you read a textbook and the author really wants to put your nose in the important point, they put it in bold type. You'll notice the different kinds of type here. This is a potentiating variable so that your eye focuses automatically on that part of the discriminative stimulus. And so potentiating variables are something that if you think of them as any kinds of arrangements or procedures that make parts of the contingency potent, you realize that all of these things are subject to it, and you have to look for whether or not, aside from whether the variable is present, is it potent at the moment? Have the arrangements been made that this is a potent arrangement for you to obtain the behavior you're interested in? These things refer to abstractional and instructional stimuli that influence what parts of the occasion are going to be controlling the behavior at the moment. So if I point to this and I say, what is this? You can say that's a no. I will say no. And I say, what is this? And you can say, it's white. Yes. Okay? I'd say, okay, what's this? Oh, that's an S. No. What is this? It's blue. Yes. Okay, now I go to some other place. I don't have any other colors. Oh, what's this? Without telling you to say what color, you'll say gray. That's abstractional control, where the control by one dimension of the discriminative stimulus comes from exposure to the contingencies. And you don't have to give, this is what in programmed instruction is called egg rule learning, where you provide examples. You don't give a definition, but the learner creates the definition through their behavior in response to all the examples and non-examples. And we have lots of examples of this kind of procedure, but it's important to understand what that is. The other is instructional control, and it's just conditional discrimination. Not just, but it's a form of conditional discrimination where I can say to you, what is this color? And you say gray. If I say, what is this shape? It's a rectangle. What is the dimensionality? It's a two-dimensional display. I can change your response by providing a stimulus that acts to essentially guide which way you're going to respond to the SDs that I'm presenting. And so understanding something about stimulus control becomes really important when you're trying to get a kid to do discriminations of objects. It's important to be sure that they're actually looking at the objects and that when they say car, they're looking at the car. And that, in fact, they're not looking at the corner of the card where it's bent or anything else. And there are ways of testing that, but we skip over those steps very often because we aren't sensitive enough to just how complicated a lot of these simple behaviors we're trying to put in place are. The original people in behavior analysis, the guys who came from experimental labs and worked with kids and worked with psychiatric patients were really aware of this stuff. And the quality of the work at that time really shows. Some of the other things that matter, stimulus props. Now, I know people haven't heard of that, but what we mean by that are the stimuli that are in the background while the contingency is in effect, and they don't influence it, but if they change, they disrupt performance in the contingency. I don't know if you've ever been in a room listening to a talk and the lights flickered and everybody stops, the speaker stops talking, people look around, they aren't paying attention to the front of the room, they're looking at the lights, and you know, the speaker says, oh, ghosts, and everybody laughs. It disrupts the lecture. It disrupts the flow of it. That's what we mean by stimulus props, like the props in a play. You go to see Oedipus, and the columns in the background that represent the temple fall down, and everybody, stops talking for a minute. It disrupts the play. The props in the background, if they're changed, can disrupt the behavior in the contingency. Well, is it always going to happen? No, because if it disrupts it a few times, after a while, it has no effect any longer. In fact, Nate Azrin reported a study called the some effects of noise on operant behavior, where he demonstrated that if he put on a white noise generator, the first few times he turned it on, it disrupted the operant performance. But after a while, it had no effect, so he turned it on permanently. And the animals kept working. Now, the next session, instead of turning it on, he turned it off. And turning it off disrupted the performance. It's the background stimulation, changes in background stimulation can disrupt behavior. And we have important examples of that when you study. If you are like a lot of American students, and you have a lot of studying to do and only a few hours to complete it, and you haven't slept in 3 days, people pop pills. They take amphetamines to stay awake. And they study and they study and they study, and the next day when they go to take their exam, they don't take more amphetamines and they don't remember anything that they learned because the stimulus props have changed. But if they take amphetamine before the exam, it comes back. That's in pharmacology, they say state-dependent learning. But everything is state-dependent learning. It's the state of the contingency relation and the context of the contingency at the time it established control over behavior. And that's, when's the last time you read anything about the effects of stimulus props? You know, you see some examples of them used practically. If you're doing table work, if you're doing table work and you're putting cards down and you have a child who begins grimacing, they look, no! You know, just to startle them. It's not punishment, you're just startling them so they stop this and they come back and you say, good, here, what's this? It disrupts the behavior they're engaging in that keeps them from coming under control of the discriminative stimuli you're presenting. So you can use some of these things effectively, but you have to know what they are, and you have to be careful not to overuse them because they stop working if you do. Those are important things to know, and we don't teach a lot of this stuff. Another thing that's, it's becoming more popular, I was asked to talk to a bunch of professional animal trainers last year about something called contingency-induced patterns. You might have heard of schedule-induced behavior, schedule-induced polydipsia, schedule-induced aggression, schedule-induced pica, air licking, a whole variety of things. It's behavior that it occurs reliably as an adjunct or as an addition to the behavior that the contingency controls, but it is not reinforced by the contingency. It occurs under very specific contingency circumstances, and it can include a whole variety of patterns. The problem is that sometimes these contingency-induced patterns can lead to difficulties. When I was at the University of Chicago, I was asked, or at the University of Illinois Hospital, I was asked to talk to people at something called the Illinois State Psychiatric Institute. One of our physicians was doing a drug study there with chronic patients who were diagnosed with schizophrenia. They were trying a new drug. And they were having real difficulties because people began almost dying from the medicine. And they had the doses right, it was tested as being safe, but they were developing something called hyponatremia. They were losing sodium. And it turned out that this hospital had walls like this. They were brick walls, parallel, very long hallways, and it went down one direction. In the middle was the nurses' station, and then there was another hallway down the other end. And at each end, there was a drinking fountain. And the people spent their day pacing the halls. They would walk from one end to the other. They would stop at the nursing station and look in, and sometimes people would wave and say, how are you doing? Fine. And they would walk to the other end. And every time they reached the end of the hall, even though they might not have been thirsty, they began drinking water. And they sat and guzzled water, and then they would turn around and walk back the other way. And when they get to the other end, they would drink water at that end. And because they were drinking so much water, they were urinating and losing sodium. And because of the sodium imbalance, the sodium deficit, the drugs were almost killing them. And so what we ended up doing was rearranging the unit routine, turning off one of the fountains at a given time, so it increased the inter-response time between drinking one time and drinking the other. We manipulated things that we knew affected contingency-induced patterns or schedule-induced behavior, and it all dropped out within 2 or 3 days. They thought they were going to have to go back to the laboratory to test this drug again, when it was really the routine on the unit that was creating this kind of contingency-induced it was polydipsia. They were drinking too much water and losing salt. So these can be important patterns. The last variables that I'm going to put up here include, this represents the contingencies as they are now, but the contingencies change over time. In fact, when we talk about shaping or fading or just reinforcement histories, we're talking about what condition this contingency was at other points in time. When you look back and try to recapture what those contingencies were, we call that history. You know, that's what Freud was interested in. People make fun of Freud and say, oh, you know, what a weirdo and so on. But Freud's main contribution, or one of his major contributions to the way we think about psychology, is that history is important. That history is what brought us to where we are now, and to understand what happens right now, we have to understand a little bit about history. Now, he went off the deep end describing history. He described it in terms of a theory that had no real concrete reference, but it was a brilliant insight that our behavior at the moment isn't just a reaction to stimuli that are present in the moment, that you may respond very differently to something from the way I do. When we are back at this point and we're looking forward and we say, we want the person to be able to do this at some point, and so you construct a series of changes in the contingency that will produce this outcome, that prospective look we call a program. That's what it means with a program. We're going to provide the learner with a history that will result in the pattern that we would consider the objective for our program. So when we talk about contingencies, this is what we're talking about, not just reinforcers and occasions and behaviors. And this takes a little bit of work to understand some of these things. When we talk about things like the matching law, and we talk about amelioration strategies and so on, when we talk about decision theory, when we talk about signal detection theory, that's where these alternatives and the alternative costs and benefits of these different contingencies all come into play. Those techniques or those laboratory studies that try to quantify these things are really just trying to formally describe how they're related and how they influence each other. But the fundamental underlying phenomenon is still important in a practical sense. You don't have to do the calculations, but you do have to be aware of the alternative costs and benefits. I worked with a guy who was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. He was trying to finish his PhD, and he had been in the program for 23 years, and he just couldn't finish. He had maybe 50 or 60 publications. He knew about 25 languages, Middle Eastern languages, that aren't even spoken anymore. These are dead languages. He was, in some cases, the only person who knew what that language was, and he taught other professors bits and pieces and did translations for other people. He had a library, a professional library, that was better than the collection in the university library. He had more original sources and so on, but he just could not get his dissertation done. And so, you know, he was brought up in a team meeting, and over the years, because he had been there so long, he asked the department he was in whether he could have some space for a little bit more space for an office to keep his book collection, and also some tables, because people who come to his office and want help, they have to put materials out. And so they gave him a boiler room in the basement, a big room, big empty room, and told him, do what you want. He put in bookcases, he put in library tables, he had a good desk for working in, he improved the lighting. He had one of the nicest offices in the building, in the basement, and he was a grad student finishing his degree. Make a long story short, the treatment plan for this guy was to do an operation on his brain, because the head neurologist said, there is a circuit in the cingulate gyrus and the signal keeps going around and it won't stop. And so what we're going to do is cut that tissue so that the signal won't just keep going around and he'll be fine. So they did it, and it didn't work. And he said, well, that's because we didn't do the other side, so we're going to do it bilaterally. And they did a bilateral cingulotomy, and after a few weeks when the operation healed, that didn't help either. And so, you know, he said, well, it seems that he doesn't want to get better. And so I said, well, here's a question for you. How's he paying for 23 years of graduate school? You know, I don't know about you, but graduate school cost me every moment I was there. And this guy was there for 23 years. So I said, how does he pay for it? Oh, well, he has a trust fund, and he gets $200,000 a year from his trust, so he doesn't have to worry about tuition. I said, he also doesn't have to worry about graduating. What happens when he graduates? You're going to kick him out of the nicest office in the entire campus. You're going to make him break up his collection. You're going to force him to go out and get a job probably at some second-rate state school where they aren't going to let him even think about doing the kinds of research that he's really interested in. This is a beautiful operant. And it boils down to, what are the alternatives? Okay, so he finishes his degree. It costs him something terrible. The solution was, we had his family endow the university with a research associate chair that he was then appointed to, so he was going to be a faculty member the moment he graduated, and his only responsibility was to teach whatever he wanted, one class per year, and just do whatever research he wanted, and it was a permanent job. It wasn't tenured, but it was permanent. As long as he was alive, he could sit in that chair because there was always money for it. 3 months later, he finished his dissertation. The alternatives governed his behavior. It made perfect sense, but it was defined as a disease because people didn't consider what the alternatives were for this guy. So when we talk about analyzing contingencies, those are insights that if you understand some of these interactions between contingency elements, you don't fall prey to all the easy answers that you get. Okay, a couple of the problems. And I don't know if you're aware of what's happening with autism treatment in the United States, but there's a huge demand. We have more and more kids diagnosed on the autism spectrum, and nowhere nearly enough qualified people to do the work. And so many universities are pushing to train applied behavior analysts at the master's level. Bachelor's programs are putting out BCABAs, that's the board certified assistant behavior analyst, and graduate programs are putting out board certified behavior analysts, BCBAs, at the master's level. And we're trying to push, I think Neil showed 26,000 at the moment? That's an extraordinary number of people considering we were only at about 5,000, 5 years ago, 6 years ago? It was a very small group. Now there's a kind of a strategy to this, and I will hark back to evolutionary biology. In evolutionary biology, there are two strategies for reproduction. They aren't things the animals plan. They're just descriptions of some major ways in which animals reproduce. And there are two main branches. One is called an R-intensive strategy, and the other is K-intensive. R-intensive means that reproduction successfully and survival depends very little on anything other than producing so many offspring that nothing can kill them off fast enough. Oysters do this. Oysters reproduce 180 billion offspring per oyster per year. That's a lot of oysters, baby oysters. So even if the biggest Psadia and the thalassa come in and eat most of them, there are enough of them there that you're not going to have a shortage. One of the consequences is that the oysters don't have to adapt. And so if I go fishing in Colorado back in the States, and I'm at the top of a mountain that used to be an ocean 50 million years ago, I find oyster shells that look just like the ones that are on the shores of Massachusetts right now. They don't look any different because they didn't have to change. They just relied on producing so many offspring. So our intensive strategies produce an awful lot of offspring, but they don't produce much variability, and they don't do much creativity. Oysters have a shell, and they've got their guts inside open, and they let water in, and they filter out a little bit of food, and then they make more oysters. They don't build Parthenons. They don't write music. They don't have Lady Gaga oysters. Anyway, that's one strategy, and it's effective if that's what you want to do, is simply survive. There's another strategy called K-intensive, which refers to, the K is supposed to be carrying capacity, although they don't know how to spell, biologists, but it refers to how much the resources can sustain the organisms. And we are, as humans, we're really at the very top of this. You don't produce many offspring, but you invest a lot of resources in making sure the ones you produce survive. Humans and great apes and cetaceans, whales and dolphins and elephants and some of the larger animals are very K-intensive. In other words, we have all sorts of adaptations that we invest in taking care of our children. We invest in obtaining food for them, sheltering them until they're at an age where they can do it for themselves. We have all sorts of special adaptations for finding food and for doing a whole variety of things. We have really sort of overdone it. But those two strategies lead to very different outcomes. And the fast one, as I said, doesn't give much variability, and you don't get a lot of creativity and so on. The K-intensive one does. Well, part of my concern about very rapidly growing the field and putting as many people out there as possible is that we're imitating sort of a K-intensive strategy a lot of times. We have to focus the training on producing the minimal competencies in a variety of areas to be able to get enough of these technicians out there to do the work. Okay, we want to get people out there. And so they don't do a laboratory course for a semester on stimulus control. In fact, one of the problems that I find, and it's been a problem since I was in grad school, in behavior analysis, we have no advanced textbooks to speak of, especially in the experimental analysis of behavior. Where are the advanced textbooks on stimulus control or on contingency-induced behavior? Anyway, when we talk about training people who are technically competent, we want our procedures to be implemented in applied settings with high fidelity. We want people to use them correctly, to use them under the right circumstances, to obtain reliable outcomes. We want to be able to have those procedures be objective enough that somebody from the outside can observe them and say, yes, this is what they did. And so that's one of the mandates of good technical training. And that's, and I'm not using technical to put down that. What I mean by that, though, is it's the techniques that you derive from your understanding of the fundamental principles that you have to apply. If you want to call it a technology of behavior, it has to be applied correctly. And as I said, if you want to turn enough people out with that kind of technical expertise in a short period of time, you can't give them the depth in other areas. It's just not, it's not likely. Some of the areas that are neglected are things like stimulus control. You know, people who used prompts a lot don't understand some of the stimulus control research that went into defining that. You know, I hear people talk about how the animal laboratory leads people in the applied area to these things, and then they move away. Actually, Herb Terrace's invention of fading was from the other way around. He hung around with a lot of instructional programming people at Columbia, and they had been using those kinds of procedures in programmed instruction for a long time. And he said, well, I wonder if I can get my pigeons to do this line tilt discrimination that way, because he was trying to teach them to discriminate between a horizontal and a vertical line. Let me, if you're not familiar with this, let me tell you this just because it is also another one of the things that when we talk about giving people technical training, a lot of times they don't get other kinds of training outside of behavior analysis that are important, like some training, basic biology. Herb Terrace couldn't get pigeons to discriminate a vertical line from a horizontal line. And he did thousands and thousands and thousands of trials, and the birds couldn't learn it. I know pigeons. They are not stupid. But it was really obvious they didn't know what he was asking them to do. And the idea was, and we had an ethologist at the University of Chicago who gave the explanation that, well, you realize, of course, birds can fly, and so for them, horizontal and vertical lines aren't important because they see them from all directions, so they don't make that distinction. They don't see them the way we do. And I'm thinking, I've never seen a pigeon try and land on the side of a wall. They always go onto the vertical surfaces. So that just didn't make sense. And Herb Terrace knew that they could do color discrimination, so he taught them first to discriminate colors, and then he superimposed the horizontal and vertical lines on those, and gradually reduce the salience of the colors. Now, at some point, the pigeon's going to be looking at the red key that was SD, and the vertical line will be there, so that by the time the red light goes away, it's going to respond out of the red line that it was looking at the last time the food came. And all of a sudden, you've transferred stimulus control to this line. What happened to the inability, biological inability of these organisms to make that discrimination? How many times have you heard people explain some of the deficits in autism as being biological in nature, or in mental retardation, or in any of the kinds of cognitive syndromes that people say, well, they're not capable of doing this? So stimulus control is a really important area. Verbal behavior. What are the guidelines? How many hours of contact do you have to have with verbal behavior materials? Was it 30 or 20? Some very small amount. Yeah. I don't know about you, but it took me longer than that to read the book. But we don't spend enough time talking about verbal behavior and making sure that people really understand what verbal behavior is about. It's about operant behavior that just has a very specific and peculiar topography to it. But there's nothing inherently different about verbal behavior. And yet, because of our cultural histories, because of our past learning, there is an awful lot of misunderstanding of what is in verbal behavior. And, you know, combine that with the stimulus control. When we talk about verbal behavior, we're talking about productive language, people speaking or signing or making whatever kinds of gestures it takes to deliver mands to somebody else or to engage in interverbal behavior with another person. But it doesn't tell us how you understand language. The place where that occurs is in the stimulus control areas, and even when we do have students learn about stimulus control, we rarely talk about the behavior of the audience as a form of complex stimulus control. And that's an area that we need research in. How is it that we hear one thing and the interverbals take over, and before the person has finished the sentence, we have an argument for them? We are responding with a very strong verbal response of our own to a discriminative stimulus presented interverbally to us by another speaker. That's really impressive stimulus control, and we don't understand as well as we should how that works. So you want to teach language to a child, you need to know something about this in a little more depth. It's not enough to show them cards and have them learn words and tact pictures, and eventually you get around to having them do sort of interverbal learning. It really requires that if you're going to be a behavior analyst and the cards aren't working, or you can't, you know, it's those of you who've tried, it's very difficult to teach a kid when you hand them a book and say, this is my book, and the kid says, this is my book. You say, no, this is my book. You know, you feel like you're in a comedy routine. No, this is your book. This is your book. No, that's yours. This is mine. That's yours. That's a very difficult concept to teach children, and even though we can have them learn some rule to do that, it's not the same as understanding the difference between possession. And by understanding, I don't mean anything terribly cognitive, but having that kind of stimulus control persist across a number of settings with different objects and different possessors and so on. So stimulus control from the standpoint of verbal behavior is another area we neglect very badly. Aversive control. People still use shock collars for their dogs. They use aversive control with kids with autism, even just scolding or timeout. That's not aversive. Ask the kid. Aversive control produces all kinds of byproducts. Murray Sidman wrote an entire book about some of the byproducts of aversive control. Nate Azrin did a lot of studies demonstrating all of these side effects of aversive control and demonstrated it wasn't even a particularly good way to suppress behavior. It has very temporary effects. It's only effective as long as the punisher is present. But the minute you take that away, the underlying reinforcement contingencies that supported the behavior are going to have it come right back again in force. So unless you're prepared to stand over with the child with a stick or to teach him alternatives to get that, it's not going to work very well. And in the meanwhile, you're going to alienate other people, and you're going to produce side effects, emotional side effects, that you don't want to do. Emotions. When's the last time you read a behavior analysis textbook that had a chapter on emotions and what they're about? They are not very frequent. Now, we're fortunate enough, Dr. Gould was one of these weird operant guys who didn't come from the Harvard mafia. He came from the area of perception and sensation. So he was sort of an outsider to the traditional topics of interest, but he brought with him a lot of the interests of other psychologists, and especially in complex areas like emotion and choice and so on. And so in the 1970s, he articulated a very nice start for a behavioral theory of emotions. And Joe Lang has continued that work apace and recently published a really nice article in the European Journal of Behavior Analysis. If you haven't read it, I recommend it to you. It'll get you thinking about something that you might not have thought about before. But that's an area that we neglect. It's not just emotions like sadness and fear and anger. It's complex social emotions like envy and jealousy and this Schadenfreude, where you take joy from somebody else's misfortune. There are a variety of very complex social emotions that we haven't even begun to think about the details of the contingencies that generate those emotions and what to do with them clinically. You know, people say, well, you need to control your emotions. No, you need to control the contingencies that generate those emotions. You use the emotions as a way of tacking those contingencies. Once you notice the emotion, you say, well, I understand what I'm feeling, but what's causing this? And you begin looking at the contingencies, and you teach your clients to do that. You teach them not to be afraid or unhappy with these emotions. You teach them to look at the emotional state they're in and identify the contingencies that lead them there. It's a much more effective way of dealing with emotional difficulties in clinical settings, and we don't do a lot of that. Nonlinear contingency relations. Things like choice are often nonlinear. Your decision to do one thing is often not because of the consequences of doing that, as I said, it's because of the consequences that are attached to all the alternatives. And that's an area that even in decision theory and in all of the quantitative analysis stuff, people are forgetting about the contingencies themselves and the effects of the contingencies. And these are just a few of the areas that we don't talk about much. If you take some of the books we use to prepare people for the work of applied behavior analysis, they are very often completely unaware of some of these areas. I know that the standards try to touch on these things, but touching on them isn't the same thing as understanding them in any meaningful sense. Not just being, verbal repertoires are cheap. I think one of the things that defines what makes you a successful college student is that most people can talk. I don't mean talk casually. I mean most of you could talk much longer than most people like to hear you talk. I know that's true with me. But talking about things and being able to talk about it isn't the same as having knowledge about that area. If you talk about things and you talk about, oh, these are the things you have to do, and you can't do it, then you don't have really complete knowledge, and the knowledge that you do have isn't terribly useful. In a lot of ways, the training that we're providing at this point goes back to the early days of behavior modification, where we taught people procedures for changing behavior, but not necessarily the details of the underlying principles in those things. When we talk about functional analysis, we have Brian Iwata's wonderfully fossilized lockstep version of how to do functional analysis, but he didn't create functional analysis. It was around before, and actually if you read some of the early, Charlie Ferster did a beautiful functional analysis of depression in the 1960s. This is before people even knew that there was a field of behavior analysis, and he was using the basic fundamental knowledge from the experimental analysis of behavior to look at a complex clinical phenomenon like depression and understand it and be able to identify some of the kinds of contingency variables that in therapy you can help the person rearrange. That wouldn't pass as functional analysis nowadays. You have to do reversals and you have to try several different things. Again, we have practices where the standards have sort of fossilized them without necessarily having a convincing enough rationale for my purposes. Some of the other things, okay, this is, who the hell is Nate Azrin, or Murray Sidman, or Charlie Furster, or Susan Markle? A lot of programs have really not taken into account some of the most recent research. And again, recent research for me is even 10 years old. A lot of the stuff we teach has been around since the 1960s. It's very little change. If you look at most of the textbooks, yeah, they have newer references, but the basic principles that they focus on are the same ones they did in the 1960s, as though we don't know any more than that now. And we do. We know much more. Again, you know, we have applied behavioral procedures technologically to a whole variety of areas. Performance improvement, rehabilitation, the list, you know, the other day Neil gave a list of some of the areas, and I've got a slide presentation that has about 30 slides with 10 or 15 different applications on each one. We know how widely it's been applied. It isn't just for dogs and for defective humans the way people claimed. And yet, once we get into those settings, we don't know enough about some of those areas outside of the few operant principles that we bring to be able to have sensible discussions about some of the more subtle problems that people have in these settings. In clinical settings, a lot of times we've got these simple techniques and we make our suggestions, but we can't really discuss the phenomenology of these disorders and how the clinicians sometimes, their skills are compromised by features of the person's behavior, and how that's a verbal interchange very often, and we don't have a way of actually communicating with those people about these without training our folks adequately. Those are very subtle kinds of interactions. This opening, though, is also, again, I said you have to know a little bit about your history. You know, if you're familiar with Freud, he used the story of Oedipus as the central metaphor. And it was largely Oedipus, his tragedy was not being aware of the prophecy, of his fulfillment of the prophecy. And the real issue with Oedipus was that he didn't recognize himself as the answer to the riddle of the Sphinx, and that's why he missed everything else. And in a lot of ways, we do the same thing. When we don't understand where we came from, we don't understand what the people who started the field did and where they were heading, and so we've gone on the other road. We're on our way to Corinth instead of where he went and met his end. When we talk about this stuff, they aren't acquainted with some of the original people. Murray Sidman, who's best known probably among current students, and largely because in autism training now we're starting to bring in stimulus equivalence as one of the methods for teaching language and for teaching tax especially. But Murray did a lot more than that. He contributed to some of the most fundamental knowledge in avoidance behavior, and certainly his work on experimental design and explaining some of these designs and creating an actual formal model for doing single organism research. Many students don't know Murray Sidman's name. You know, they might know Sidman and Tailby, or they may have read one or two papers in stimulus equivalence as an assignment in grad school, but they're not familiar with the work that he did. Nate Azrin. Nate Azrin was one of the first operant people to work with kids with autism. People don't know that. Charlie Furster did work with kids with autism even earlier than Nate. Charlie Furster is a guy who worked with Skinner. He's, of course, Furster and Skinner, the Schedules of Reinforcement book. He did the basic research, and he also he did a program to help people to change their eating habits, change their diet habits. Those procedures are probably the standard behavioral procedures used in clinics around the world, and our students don't even know that that was Charlie Furster's work. So we're doing a disservice by not teaching some of the really very early literature and showing in a story, like in a narrative, how those research efforts and those research questions grew and how they proceeded to give us the knowledge we have now. And it's a loss. These people had no training in applied areas. They didn't have supervised practica. They had an experimental background, and when they walked into an applied setting, they treated it like they were working with pigeons and rats. And they applied the same kind of experimental eye and the same kind of scientific database to understanding what they were seeing. And that's lost when we don't have that as part of our instruction. So the likely future is going to be that we're going to have the numbers, we're going to fill the market with these people, and then the moment that either autism is no longer fashionable or it's cured, we're going to have a bunch of people standing around with nothing to do because they aren't going to be invited to do other more serious things. That was the autism cure, and now we don't need them anymore. And they won't be trained to do a lot more than that either. The other thing we can do is go back to our root interests. You know, it's too bad that we settled on radical behaviorism as a term for root instead of, you know, how would be rhizoid behavior analysis for rhesus? You know, we go back to our rhesus. Anyway, we want to go back to our root interests. We want to talk about what it means to have faith, what it means to love music, or to love somebody else, or to be terrified of failure. Those are things that are phenomenologically what we would like to explain. Why literature affects us the way it does. Those are our root interests, and we don't talk about that very much in our curricula because we're too busy focusing on procedures. Reinvestment in a comprehensive science. Start having animal research again and having our applied students do some animal research. There's nothing more instructive than trying to figure out what a pigeon wants so that when you sit down across the table from a kid with autism, you can apply the same kinds of precise reasoning to look at what they're doing and how that relates to what they must want. And animal training is a great way to do that. Most of the people that founded the field had animal research with Skinner or Keller or one of these people, and it helped train them to have these discriminative eyes. I would say more extensive training in what the experimental analysis of behavior has revealed about a lot of these areas before students go on to do a master's in the area. And finally, you know, I put behavioral technicians because we don't call them behavior technicians, but we do call them applied behavior analysts when many are trained primarily as technical people with technical expertise. And I don't think that's the same as behavior analysis. There's less analysis going on, a lot more behavior change, and for me that's technical work. So with that, I will say thank you again. And